Paukwa, sahani, giza, na baiskeli. So this is how we do in East Africa, right? You know what happens next? What's coming? Hadithi, hadithi. So, allow me to tell you 2 stories tonight. Our first story starts at the turn of the last century, near the slopes of Mount Kenya. And it starts with the sounds of newborn babies crying, the heart-wrenching sound of wailing twins that rises up into the forest, until the hyenas came. For you see, in this part of the world, twins were considered a bad omen. And as soon as they were born, they were taken from their mother and placed in the forest for nature to take its course. Now, a few days later, in the same homestead where this forest was, a new mother died 5 days after giving birth to a little girl. And as was customary, her body was left in her hut with her newborn baby who was still alive. And once again, the cries of an infant child rose to haunt this homestead. And the villagers of the homestead said, no. We cannot take this once again. We cannot wait again for the hyenas to come. And so what happened? They took the baby girl and gave her to the mother of the twins, who just happened to be her paternal aunt. And so, by an odd twist of fate, the baby girl's life was saved. Now, a few years later, in this same area, a terrible leprosy-like epidemic came to sweep the land. And the little girl, now 8 years old, knew that this disease had found her, for her arms and her hands started twisting and crippling right in front of her. But she was a plucky girl, and she had heard that there were some strangers with a cure. Some red strangers called Adogo. So, she took her little 8-year-old self and set off on the longest solo trek of her life in order to find a cure. Now, the solo trek was all of 3 kilometers. But she was 8, and it was 1908. There was no Google Maps. So, it was through the forest, over the valleys, across the mountains, until she came to the newly established Tomo Tomo mission. And here, she found not only her cure, but a lifeline. She found a new faith. She was baptized and given a new name. And she found this strange new world called education. So this became Marion's story. Marion, the little 8-year-old girl, continued to live at the mission for several years. She grew up, she studied, she became a nurse, she married, and in time had children. Not 2, not 4, not 6, or even 7. Marion had 11 children. Clearly, a strong young woman. So Marion's story continued. And her 11 children knew, if there was one thing you did in Marion's house, it was that you went to school. And so, her first daughter, a young lady by the name of Ella Murigo, decided to follow in her mother's footsteps, and she became a nurse. Now, in her own time, Ella also had a daughter, a beautiful baby girl. But fate can be cruel. And before her daughter's 2nd birthday, Ella died after contracting typhoid during her nursing duties. And so, her little baby girl, named for Marion, was given over to Marion and became her ward. Now, this baby girl, whose name was Gemma, was always small. You know, that kid was always the smallest in her class. But she was Marion's child. She was Marion's granddaughter. And therefore, at the tender age of 5, was given a slate and told, go to school. And so she did. And Gemma was smart, and she was tenacious, and she excelled in everything that she did. Eventually, she found herself at Alliance, where apparently all smart people used to land. And in time, heard that after she graduated from high school, she had been called to the University of East Africa, Nairobi campus. And so, on a bright, beautiful Nairobi sunny day in 1967, Gema found herself in the registration line, waiting to register for her BA degree. Now, this was 1967, and this was a big city. So no doubt the afro was tight, the skirt was short, and the boots were long. So let us leave that story for a moment and go back in time, again, to before the turn of the last century. And here, south of Mount Kenya, near the Thika River, right there on the banks, we find a man's man. You know the full dume? Proverbial bad boy. His name, Mureu, as it would be. More accurately, Mureu, wa Mukirai, wa Dhairo, wa Makumi. This guy was so strong. He had single-handedly fought a leopard and won the fight. Everybody in the neighborhood knew that crazy guy is not the guy who you mess with. So Mureu was a wealthy, wealthy man. And we know this because he managed to have enough goats to pay dowry for not 2, not 4, not 6 or even 7, but 11 good wives. Now, the youngest of these wives, the one who probably took him back to the days of his youthie, was a beautiful girl called Gasheri, as she would be called. Now, Gasheri bore Mureu 6 children, and the oldest son that she gave him was a young man called Kifuja. Now, Kifuja grew up in the changing times of Kenya colony, where life wasn't too favorable for Africans. And in 1939, as a young man, he was called up to go and fight for king and country. He was sent off to Ethiopia to fight, and after a time, luckily, I think for him, he fell ill. Ill enough to be sent back to Nairobi in 1942 to recuperate. And he did so at the Army Hospital at Kabete Barracks, just here on Mwihaki Way. After some time, Kifuja was medically discharged and told, "You may now go home." But he arrived back home a very different man from that which left. For he had realized that even though he was good enough to fight in the king's army, he was still a second-class citizen in this here Kenya. Nevertheless, he decided to do what all warrior men do when they have come of age, and he found himself a wife. Just like his mother, a pretty brown girl who had a wonderful smile that would always light up her face. He got married, they had children, not 2, not 4, not 6 or even 7, but 11 children. Now, the oldest of these children was a boy, and he was named Kimura. He was named Kimura for the small sword his crazy grandfather, Mureu, used to carry. Now, Kimura was short-sighted, but this didn't stop him from loving to read. He had a natural curiosity, he had an insatiable appetite for knowledge, and an uncanny ability to remember anything that you ever told him. Now, Kimura grew, went to high school, graduated, and while he was waiting to be called to university, decided to go and work at the Del Monte at the Del Monte pineapple plant in Thika. He did so, and after a couple of months, he was told, "You've been registered for a BCom degree at the University of East Africa." So in 1967, off he went to registration day. Standing in line, what does he find in front of him but a pretty young thing who had arrived at registration without a pen? So she turns around and asks him, "Can I borrow your pen?" And Kimura is like, "Okay." And he proceeds to remove his brand new Parker pen, bought with his hard-earned pineapple money, over to the pretty young thing. She says thanks, turns around, fills in her registration form, and proceeds to leave with said pen. A couple of weeks later, he finds himself at Snow Cream. You know there, just by University Way? Yes. There's Snow Cream. And it's pouring with rain. And who does he see? Young lady. But this time he's like, "I've spotted my gap, but I'm smarter about things." So he walks over to her and he says, "Would you like to share my umbrella?" She agrees. And they walk across University Way back to the lecture halls. And for the next 3 years, these two, the girl from Tomo Tomo and the boy from Thika River, hang out. Hang out so much that by the time they've graduated, they've decided, you know what? Let's make this permanent. And so, on a beautiful day, in a church overlooking the great court of the university where they first met, they tied the knot. And a few months later, there was me. You see, this is my story. The weaving of me began long, long ago. I am many, many things. I am opportunities. I am people's aspirations. I'm almost didn't happen moments. I am Marion's spirit, but I'm also Ella's tragedy. I'm Gasheri's beauty, but I'm also Moreau's cray-cray. I am Kifuja's bitterness, and I'm Kimura's love of books. I am Gema's tenacity, and I am me. I'm all of this and so much more. For my story is still being written. My chapters continue to unfold each day. Our personal stories give us purpose. They give us identity. They give us possibility. And the beautiful thing is I'm not alone. For the one thing that we each have is a story. We are all representatives of a world that has died and forebearers of a time that we will never see. But the stories will live on. And so I ask you, this beautiful, beautiful nation of ours can be thought about as a quilt of many, many, many stories, each one unique, each one beautiful, so many waiting to be unearthed, treasured, told and shared and celebrated. And I often wonder, if we took the time to look back into the threads of our stories, how would it change us? What would we value if we knew that everything around us that has been built and collected has been done so on a bed of tragedy, of sacrifice, or of pride? I think that we'd be a much more appreciative people, a prouder nation. I think that it's time to tell our stories. For the seeds of our past define the people who we are. And so, will you join me in weaving the quilts of our stories? I ask you. Paukwa.